He was one of the most sadistic and terrifying killers in Soviet history. A man who killed with unimaginable cruelty, leaving a trail of horror that shocked an entire nation. His name became infamous, etched into criminology textbooks as the embodiment of evil. Responsible for over 50 brutal murders, he managed to evade capture for 12 long years. Exactly 30 years ago, justice finally caught up with him, and he was executed. But who was Andrei Chikatilo, and how did his reign of terror go unchecked for so long? We are now in the year 1936 in Soviet Union. These were some of the darkest years in Soviet history, shaped by Joseph Stalin's brutal policies of collectivization and totalitarian control. Stalin's government had launched a massive campaign to seize control of agriculture across the Soviet Union. Private farms were abolished, and land, livestock, and tools were forcibly taken from farmers to create a state-controlled collective farms. Those who resisted were labeled as kulaks, wealthy peasants, which became a term of scorn. They were arrested, deported, or even executed. The collectivization policy was a disaster. It caused a sharp drop in agricultural productivity as farmers, stripped of their land and livelihoods, had no incentive to work. The Soviet government exacerbated this crisis by demanding impossibly high grain quotas from Russia, often taking the majority of the harvest to meet export goals and fund industrialization. This left little to no food for the local population. The result was the Holodomor, a man-made famine that ravaged Russia between 1932 and 1933. Millions of people starved to death. Entire villages were wiped out. People resorted to desperate measures just to survive. There were even accounts of cannibalism in some regions. Though the famine officially ended before Andrei Chikatilo was born, its effects lingered. Hunger, poverty, and the trauma of those years hung like a shadow over the country. It was in this harsh and unforgiving environment that Andrei Chikatilo entered the world on October 16, 1936, in a town of Yablachny. His family was among the countless who lived in crushing poverty. They survived in a tiny one-room hut with no electricity, running water, or basic necessities. His parents worked long hours on the collective farms, struggling to earn even meager rations. They were existing to make ends meet and to somehow survive. Andrei later claimed that his parents had an older son named Stepan, who tragically disappeared during the famine, before Andrei was born. According to Andrei, Stepan was kidnapped and cannibalized by their starving neighbors, an unimaginable horror that haunted him for the rest of his life. While there is no concrete evidence that Stepan ever existed, this story became a dark legend in Andrei's mind, fueling a lifelong fear of being eaten. Dang, that must have been scary. To make matters even worse, when Andrei was just 4 years old, Germany invaded Russia in 1941, and the Soviet Union entered World War II. Life became even more brutal. Villages burned, families were torn apart, and brutal violence took over the streets. Andrei witnessed some truly horrifying things during this time. Bodies lying in the streets, homes bombed into rubble, and his own village caught in the chaos of war. One of Andrei's most harrowing memories was the day his curiosity nearly cost him his life. Along with a group of local boys, he secretly watched as Nazi soldiers rounded up village residents for execution. As the horrific scene unfolded, the soldiers turned their weapons on the children. Andrei ran as fast as he could, but he tripped, fell, and lost consciousness. When he woke up, he found himself in a pile of corpses. Terrified and barely able to breathe, he lay still, afraid to move a muscle in case the soldiers realized he was alive. That kind of experience, it's the stuff of nightmares, and it left scars on Andrei's psyche. In 1943, Andrei's younger sister, Tatiana, was born. However, who her father was remains a mystery, as Andrei's father was still away on the front lines. Andrei himself said that allegedly his mother was sexually assaulted by one of the German soldiers, and that this happened in front of little Andrei. Well, Tatiana's birth only deepened the family's struggle, bringing more mouths to feed amidst worsening poverty and hunger. In September 1944, Andrei Chikatilo started first grade, but life wasn't getting any easier for this family. They lived in extreme poverty. The children wore rags, and Andrei often fainted from hunger right there in the classroom. He also struggled with health issues. Andrei later said that he experienced frequent headaches and dizziness as a child, and his vision began to fail early on due to severe myopia. But he was too shy to wear glasses, making it difficult for him to see or keep up with schoolwork. Andrei's shyness extended beyond his vision problems. If he didn't understand something in class or needed help, he never spoke up. He simply kept it to himself. And perhaps most humiliating was that Andrei suffered from enuresis, a condition where he couldn't control his bladder. He wet the bed regularly, and this problem persisted into his teenage years, adding another layer of shame and isolation to an already difficult childhood. Between 1946 and 1948, the Chikatilo family faced another period of famine. Andrei later claimed that he and his sister survived by eating weeds in the fields while waiting for their mother to return with food. In 1949, his father, Roman, returned after surviving the war, German captivity, and Soviet labor camps, but he was gravely ill with tuberculosis. Despite their hardships, Andrei worked hard in school and participated in extracurricular activities, but he struggled socially. Poorly dressed and often hungry, he was bullied and isolated, which pushed him to focus on his studies even more. During the summers, he worked at a collective farm where he reportedly suffered several head injuries. Now, this part is interesting because, as we know, a lot of serial killers suffered head injuries. And, in fact, some of them suffered from enuresis beyond the typical age. As Andrei entered adolescence, he became frustrated by his inability to connect with his peers, especially girls, due to his shyness and strained social interactions. This isolation would mark the beginning of deeper struggles that would shape his later life. After finishing school, Andrei went into the Soviet Army in the late 1950s. He served as a communications technician, which allowed him to travel and gain some independence. His military service was uneventful, but it gave him structure and introduced him to a new level of discipline. After leaving the army in the early 1960s, Andrei returned home and began working various jobs. Around this time, his sister introduced him to a woman named Faina Filatova through an arranged meeting. Despite Andrei's shyness, social awkwardness, and rumored impotence, they married in 1963. On the surface, the couple had a seemingly normal life. They had 2 children, a daughter, Ludmila, born in 1965, and a son, Yuri, born in 1969. Faina reportedly adored Andrei, and although their sexual relationship was strained, she never noticed anything particularly unusual about him. Neighbors and acquaintances also described him as kind, helpful, and polite. He was the type of man people would invite over for tea and trust implicitly. In the early 1970s, Chikatilo began working as a teacher at a local school. At first, he was well liked by his colleagues who threw him birthday parties and praised his contributions to the school. But beneath this friendly exterior, Andrei was harboring a disturbing dark side. While he initially appeared to be a competent teacher, troubling reports began to emerge. Andrei exhibited inappropriate behavior towards students, including touching them and exposing himself. Complaints from parents and students began piling up. Yet, instead of facing legal consequences, Andrei was dismissed, quietly dismissed, a common practice at the time to avoid scandal. Well, no, I mean, they still do that nowadays, sadly. This stark duality of a man adored by his family and neighbors, yet capable of such disturbing behavior, makes this story all the more chilling. It's hard to reconcile the image of a kind and helpful man with the monster he would later become. Soon after leaving his teaching job, Chikatilo found work as a supply clerk for a factory. This position required him to travel frequently to different cities, sourcing and delivering materials. Tragically, this job gave him the opportunity to act on his dark impulses without drawing immediate suspicion. Okay, now this is where the dark side of the story begins. On December 24th, 1978, the body of 9-year-old Lena Zakotnova was discovered in a river. Investigators noted she had suffered severe injuries. She was brutally assaulted, had multiple stab wounds, but her death was ultimately caused by asphyxiation. A detail that particularly puzzled authorities was that her eyes had been covered with her own scarf, leaving behind a haunting and perplexing scene. The investigation into Lena Zakotnova's murder quickly gained momentum, but tragically, it took a devastating turn. Authorities arrested a man named Alexander Kravchenko, who lived in the same area. Kravchenko had a criminal record, including a previous conviction for sexual assault, making him an easy target for suspicion. Besides, he himself admitted that it was he who killed Lena. Later, it came to light that he was forced to confess. Despite a lack of definite evidence linking him to Lena's murder, we also have to remember that back then, there were no such thing as DNA testing. Authorities were determined to close the case. Kravchenko was convicted and sentenced to death in what many now see as a rushed and deeply flawed trial. Before his sentencing, he changed his confession to being innocent, but in 1983, he was still executed. Chikatilo later admitted that during Lena's suffering, he experienced an intense and twisted arousal, even reaching climax. He described it as the most pleasure he'd ever felt. What a sick psycho. Honestly, people like him deserve to face the same torment they inflict on others. I'm sure of it. This is the way it has to be. After Lena's tragic death, it seemed as though similar killings stopped for nearly 2 years. Why the violence ceased remains a mystery. Perhaps Chikatilo refrained from acting on his urges, or maybe other crimes simply went unnoticed or uninvestigated. But on September 4th, 1981, the nightmare resumed. The body of a 17-year-old Larisa Tkachenko was discovered in the forest line. She was found without clothes, her belongings scattered nearby. She had been stabbed and strangled. Investigators noted disturbing details. Her mouth was filled with dirt, and her nipple was bit off. Man, that's intense. Ay, ay, ay. The main theory behind Larisa's murder, already when Andrei was caught, was that he tried to engage in sexual activity with her, but was unable to perform. When Larisa mocked him for it, he snapped. Fueled by rage and humiliation, he brutally attacked her, unleashing his frustration and violent urges. On June 12, 1982, 13-year-old Lyubov Biryuk went missing. Tragically, her body was discovered 15 days later, on June 27th. The manner of her death was similar to previous murders. Brutal assault, numerous stab wounds, but this time, the killer went even further. Her eyes were not just covered, they had been stabbed through. At the time, the term serial killer was not commonly known in the Soviet Union, but investigators began to notice chilling patterns emerging in these crimes, patterns that started pointing to the work of one man. Detectives who later worked on Chikatilo's case often spoke in horror about his sheer fearlessness. In the grip of his twisted euphoria, he seemed completely oblivious to the risk of being caught. Chikatilo carried out his killings in places where anyone could stumble upon him at any moment. Parks, overgrown bushes, and along forest belts, near busy roads. Tragically, luck was always on his side. Despite his recklessness, no one ever saw him in the act. No one was there to stop him. This lack of witnesses allowed his horrifying spree to continue for far too long. Chikatilo's youngest victim was just a 7-year-old boy named Igor Gudkov. Like many of his male victims, Igor was brutally assaulted, his eyes were removed, and his genitals mutilated. For female victims, particularly young women and girls, Chikatilo's violence took a similarly horrifying turn, sometimes even cutting out their uterus. Why? Why? Later, it was discovered that he would often take these body parts with him, and in some cases even consume them. As for why Chikatilo removed the eyes of most of his victims, he later claimed it was because he feared his image would be, quote-unquote, left in their pupils. I mean, what? It sounds absurd, but it does reveal his warped state of mind. Investigators, however, had their own theory. They believed that while Chikatilo was outwardly bold, he was ultimately a coward. He couldn't bear to see his victims' eyes. He didn't want to face their fear or their humanity. One detective who worked on the case described a chilling moment at a crime scene involving a young boy. Unlike many of Chikatilo's victims, this boy's eyes hadn't been removed. The detective recalled how the terror in the boy's eyes seemed frozen in time, capturing the horror of his final moments. It sent shivers down my spine hearing that. I honestly don't know how investigators handle seeing something like that. It's heartbreaking. Chikatilo murdered 53 people in this horrific and twisted manner. 53 people. Perhaps there were even more, but those are the ones known of. Now you're probably wondering, how did he get away with it for 12 years? How did he have the opportunity to kill so many without being stopped? Well, the truth is, he was noticed. At one point, he was even brought to a police station for acting suspiciously. Officers discovered a knife, rope, Vaseline, and other incriminating items in his bag. And what happened next? I'll tell you that in the next video, in part 2. Stay tuned.